In 1858, Minnesota became a state, and what a state it was. In Minneapolis, at least, its first 2 decades were filthy, macho, and drunken. Men were crammed into every pine plank shack, passed out on every straw stuffed bed. A Hudson's tour guide characterized Minneapolis as having an army of homeless young men. In fact, it was a city of lumberjacks, railroad builders, and river rats. That is, hobos of the river, men who drifted up and down the Mississippi, throwing up shelter whenever they wanted it. They made their living trapping, hunting, working odd jobs, or stealing. The roads were unpaved, mud tracks packed with horseshit. The garbage was burned or left to rot in the streets. The whole place stank. Dead dogs were the subject of a worried Minneapolis Tribune on July 12th, 1867. There are dead dogs laying around where they have died, and this warm weather will soon make them more of a nuisance than they were when they were alive. Dogs weren't the only problem. If cows are kept by the people in the city, complained the Tribune a month later, they should be compelled to put them in a yard overnight. It is unsafe for a person to drive through our streets in a dark night for fear of running on to cows laying in the street. They are really a great nuisance and make the streets look like barnyards. Industrial and domestic waste were dumped in the river or on the streets. By 1880s, the water was befouled, and a typhoid epidemic gripped the city, forcing sewer and water lines to be laid. In the winter, coal fires warmed the city, and coal soot cloaked the snow. The whole scene was an inducement to drink, and men drank. In 1867, Minneapolis only had about 10,000 residents, but boasted 20 licensed saloons and an equivalent number of unlicensed ones. Farmers hired Minneapolis' off-season lumberjacks and river rats as day laborers, so a sea of unemployed men was always found hanging around downtown waiting for jobs. Squalor, though, had its benefits. Low-rent shanty towns had sprung up on the outskirts of the city, along with no-rent enclaves on the flats beside the river, which had to be abandoned with every spring flood. The most violent of these shanty towns, Hell's Half Acre, occupied the block between 8th and 9th Streets on 2nd and 3rd Avenue South. Mead's History of the Police and Fire Departments described them as settlements of utter darkness, wailing, and woe. Bloody frays were a nightly occurrence. The alleys were strewn with empty beer kegs and whiskey bottles, and the latter were often used as weapons of warfare. Police were strongly discouraged from entering the area. Life was cheap there, and the community displayed such solidarity that the police were greeted with the dampening of all lanterns and candles, and were frequently pelted with bottles and rocks until they fled. I'm going to pause for a second. This is not in the article. It doesn't seem like much has changed. Life was not all lowbrow for criminals in Minneapolis in the 1870s and 80s. The population boomed from around 13,000 to around 165,000, and as in any boomtown, fortunes were made and lost with astonishing rapidity. No one helped this process more than John Flanagan, who set up what was perhaps Minneapolis' first gambling syndicate, known as the Combination, directly after the Civil War. The Combination joined together the formidable forces of Flanagan with those of Colonel Bill Tanner, St. Paul's Frank Shaw, and a handful of other gamblers. Tanner and the elite, a skinning den at 308 Nicollet Avenue on Minneapolis' most respectable an almost only paved street. Flanagan's own resort was at 205 Nicollet, and there was a saloon downstairs. Upstairs, according to Herbert Osbury's Sucker's Progress, could be found games of every description, to which the suckers were introduced by a trio of very gifted ropers who are still remembered by the old-timers in Minneapolis for their skill with which they cajoled visiting suckers. The combination, wrote Asbury, was formed by both to share information on business and customers and finance two forays against the suckers of Brainerd, Moorhead, Ironton, and other towns along the line of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Civic pride aside, Minneapolis and St. Paul served as training grounds for gamblers and table runners from Chicago, who came to try out their skills in the less dangerous pastures of the Twin Cities, where there were still plenty of suckers with the money. The Minneapolis Tribune ran an article on the hazards of these gaming dens posed to young men. "Don't you know the saloon is a trap, a deadfall, and billiards the bait? Do you not find billiards rooms mainly filled with men of loose habits and little refinement, of moderate cultivation, of doubtful honor, and standing men who will take advantage of to drive a cheap bargain, who often use profane language, who sometimes spend the night in carousel and debauchery?" The advice fell on deaf ears. For obvious reasons, few documents survive to suggest how much money was passed through these gamblers' hands, but an idea can be gotten from the report of one keno table operator who raked in $33,000 in 8 months. Much of the money in the city sharps won there on their green plush green felt fields was in fact plucked from the plush green old-growth forests of northern Minnesota. Lumber was a leading regional industry from 1860s until shortly after the turn of the century. Minneapolis life was shaped by it. Lumbering was seasonal work, October to April, because it was easier to slide trees out on ice than to drag them through the summer mud, and because summer bugs were intolerable. Lumberjacks would cut trees, brand them like cattle with particular mark for the company, drag them by sleigh to the nearest river, and dump them in. They then would rely on the river to carry the wood down to the lumber mills in the cities. The logs were caught by giant chains and stretched across the river, then sorted by brand and dispatched to the appropriate mills. So we're going to stop there for today. I'll do more a different day, but this gets interesting. The history of the city that was set up for vice and grift. Minneapolis, the city of corruption.